She is a frequent speaker at national and international forums on a wide variety of subjects. And she was formerly the museum director at the Asia Society, and it was under her leadership that a number of the shows that Melissa mentioned earlier came to fruition and has been a real leader in our field. She's also a scholar of Asian art and has published several books and articles. And she is very, very active in the field and has long been a leader and a real role model for many of us. I want to thank you again for accepting our invitation.
Thank you very much, Betty Sue. I realize it's kind of late, and I want to make sure that we really get on to the conversation at hand. The second panel, which was supposed to be the first panel, but since Melissa has to actually catch a plane to go back to New York on a red eye, so I decided we would switch, so that's what happened. This particular panel that Betty Sue and her colleagues set up is really about contemporary art and social context in philosophical terms, is their title. I was trying to figure out what does that actually mean. And basically, it has more to do with the fact that sometimes there's kind of this apparent contradiction, which is that when we think contemporary art in a Western context, it's very much about self-referential, avant-garde, individual, it's all about personal. When we think about Asia, there's always this notion of millennial, cultural, philosophical terms, and somehow they seem to be in opposition to one another. And it was very clearly set up when we first started doing this work more than 10 years ago. And the very first show that we organized, Traditions Tensions, I'll never forget this. It was Colin Cotter, front page, Arts and Leisure, New York Times. And he starts out by saying, could there ever be contemporary art in millennial cultures of Asia? A friend reminded me tartly, he said. And then he went on to say, because how could there be any such a thing? Because if it was, either it would be too provincial, or too culturally specific, or too derivative, or too one thing or the other. It couldn't possibly have that kind of a contemporary reality. Now you realize 1996 seems ages ago, and as Melissa pointed out, that issue of what is the role of millennial civilizations of Asia into the contemporary practice. When we think about contemporary practice, so how do these two things get played out, and what are the ways that we understand it? It's something that obviously the first panel also worked on. And we have a wonderful group of people, including my friend Tasneem, who is joining us from Mumbai. It's kind of very early for you, Tasneem. Yes, what time is it now?
It's 9 o'clock.
Oh, that's not so bad. That's not so bad. Okay. Before I introduce the panelists, let me just quickly also just give you two examples that will set the stage. When we did an exhibition with Shazia Sikandar and Nirima Sheikh in 2001, one of the directors of a major museum in New York said to Shazia, why do you want to be seen at the Asia Society? You are an international artist. You must not be seen in the context of such a culturally specific institution. And it was Shazia who said to the director that actually there are ways that Asia Society can ask questions that none of you who are in so-called encyclopedic contemporary museum would understand. I want to be seen in both contexts. Similarly, Shirin Nishad. We were doing a major exhibition of 17th century Safavid art. Shirin is passionate about this material, and 16th century rather. And Shirin wanted to have one of the video, which we talked about, to be seen at the Asia Society at the same time. Her dealer at the time said, no, you don't want to be seen there, because you really need to be seen at the time, the modern, etc. And she really had to fight to say, I want to be seen there because it has very specific reference to my cultural reality that in fact will come out in that context. I don't want to be an either or. The point I'm making is that there is always this issue of specificity of culture and being part of the global arena. How do we deal with both of those is in fact one of the issues that we have to look at, including 20 years from now. It would be multiplicity of context, multiplicity of meaning that we have to continue to unpack. And it is that question that I'm going to pose to my colleagues here. And let me just introduce each one of them. And Greta Erickson is somebody who's been working on contemporary Chinese work for a long, long time. She's an independent curator and a critic based right here. Santi Kaveri Bauer, who's an associate professor of art history at San Francisco State University, coming out of a training in architecture as well as in modern art. And so we're invited you here. And then next to her is Xiaoze Jie, and he is the artist and professor in art at Stanford University. And then Tasneem Zakaria Mehta, who is actually with a major museum, Dal Museum in Mumbai, and has been really doing interesting work in terms of positioning contemporary art in the context of a rather unusual traditional museum, which is not so much just an art museum. So the question I have, and I'll start with you, Greta, first, is this question of cultural specificity and being part of the global arena as you look at Chinese art and the work that you've done, is this something the artists care about, that you raise those questions? This is something that came up in the first panel as well. What is your sense of how we understand this apparent dichotomy that may not be a dichotomy?
Well, when you were relating your examples of exhibitions where the artists agreed that they would like to appear in an Asian context, it reminded me when I curated the Shubing show at the Sackler Gallery. Many artists were concerned to have this very famous Chinese artist appearing in a super Asian context. And like the examples you brought up, he realized that there are certain things you could do with an audience that's already knowledgeable that you couldn't do with a more general audience. But at the same time, there were people who would come, there was some reporter who came and wanted to do a story where he would be at the zoo because they just found a panda there, so they wanted to interview him in front of the panda, which, you know, is completely ridiculous.
That's some kind of specificity.
Yeah, right. So, but artists are, in my experience, extremely tuned into how they are presenting themselves and how they are being presented and to particular different audiences. And it is somehow considered very desirable to appear in a non-culturally specific context, so that you know you're not being presented as a panda, you're being presented as just not remarkable for your national audience, basically.
Let me just push that a little bit and ask any one of you, and that is that when we use that idea of non-culturally specific context, that often we imagine that a Western museum, such as a Museum of Modern Art, is not culturally specific. It is as culturally specific as another institution, but there's this notion that somehow global or international is non-culturally specific. And I wonder, Santi, if you have some thoughts on that. I mean, that's an interesting kind of a question to raise for all of us.
Right. Very interesting question. When I think of MoMA, right, I come from East Coast. My own biography is that, as you said, I'm grounded in modern art. asking my advisor, where should I go for graduate work? And she said, well, you're Indian, go study Indian art. And I was just flabbergasted. Why? Why is that the necessary step for me? She said, very practically speaking, the jobs are there. And she was right. And, but you know, MoMA was my second home. I had year-long internships there. I knew people, curators, and I just didn't feel like I had to be a stranger to them. But they are culturally specific. I think they speak to a very unique culture. They have a very singular narrative about Western art and its developments, its dialectics, its teleology, if you will, that often has nothing or little to do with what's going on with modernisms around the world. So in that sense, Alfred Barr's map has nothing to do with the Good Time movement or with Shantiniketan, Kalabhavan, and Rabindranath Tagore, who were thinking of how to place themselves as modern artists at the early 20th century. Alfred Barr has nothing to do with that. So I think we have to use the word universal differently. And MoMA sets itself up, and I think SF MoMA does too in a way, sorry, I'm sorry, as presenting art as a universal statement of modernism. But there's so many different languages of modernism that are going on at the same time. So when I teach contemporary art, and to my students, I always begin with the modern moment. And I never really create that break that, okay, all of a sudden now we're in a contemporary moment. That dialectic continues, and it's a story that has to be grounded in a local situation, local contingencies, and also process, I think, is very important. These artists are thinking about indigenous materiality when they create their work. So the local is important, the global is important. They have to be in a constant tension and conversation with each other. That's my take.
Which is partly that you have to interrogate the very notion that global is without ethnicity.
Right.
That often global is in fact Western-oriented, dominated conversation that's quite different. I wonder if you might talk to us a little bit about the perspective that's, especially in China, from the early 1990s as the contemporary art gets seen in the West. Some people have felt that many artists then bought into sort of the Mao pop and things that were seen as Chinese in a global context, and that was the only way to really get ahead in an international arena. What's your sense of where the Chinese artists are today compared to perhaps in the early 1990s?
I want to follow up on the previous questions first, if I may do so. So anyway, we talk about the global versus the local. The dynamic sounds a bit, related to what's the mainstream, what's the center, as opposed to the peripheral, in which there's no such a clear boundary drawn anymore. But I guess it is the artist, many artists fear to become part of the peripheral, to be sort of on the edge. Okay. Well, so I've just realized that I'm actually the only practicing artist on the panel among people on these two panels. So I would like to sort of talk from my own kind of experience, struggling of an artist who just I came to the States from China in '92. And so I went to graduate school, and the first solo show I got was a solo show at the Dallas Visual Arts Center as part of the Mosaic series. The Mosaic series is a sequence of small solo shows of artists with different ethnic backgrounds. So I guess I got a show because I am a Chinese artist. And at that time, I always feel kind of ambivalent about it. Okay, do I want myself to be seen as a Chinese artist? Because I'm Chinese. And so I guess in my own practice, I have a problem with categorization and classification. I feel like part of my work responds to my experience in the West, in the US. You know, my paintings about the Iraq War and you know, how artists reflected in the Western media. And I also deal with my past, my cultural heritage. So I think it's part of my, part of my upbringing, part of my experience. It is not a strategic kind of self-framing. It is not a self-positioning. Like, okay, I want to be seen as a Chinese artist or an Asian artist. I think the work, you know, what I want to do in my work comes first, and then it is your job. Everyone has to do the framing, to do the interpretation, and I almost feel like, you know, I should not be thinking too much in those terms.
You want to do, and then let the curators figure out what they need to do, right?
I guess.
Okay. Dusty, you obviously have come into the contemporary scene neither as an art historian nor as a contemporary curator, but you're working with contemporary artists in the Maharaja Museum context. Tell us a little bit about how you are situating your artists, especially in that social context and milieu of a neighborhood that is outside of South Bombay, fashionable, where all the other contemporary art galleries are. So what is that cultural context for artists as they're creating work in your institution?
Vishaka is very unclear discussion. I don't get you. I could not hear the other panelists. Are you able to hear me clearly?
We can hear you, but there is a kind of a breakup in your voice. Can you hear me all right?
So almost. I have this word. So I will just speak very slowly so that you can, I hope, understand what I'm saying. Maharaja, which is the erstwhile Victorian Albert Museum, is the only museum in Mumbai, and in its time it was very much a contemporary museum reflecting the arts of the day. So it was not ever conceptualized as a historic museum. So very much like written, and the technology included everything. It was the only museum. So it had an encyclopedic school. Now, by inviting artists to comment on this closed legacy, as well, we stored the museum and we got UNESCO's highest restoration, and that is really very unique in India, because as you know, most of the museums in India are lying in a modern state. They predominantly community. So one of the ways of reactivating the space and looking at the local legacy and looking at the city, museum says, we are engaging the contemporary because we reflect history and its culture, but also inheriting the past, inheriting that history. And the artists that have to tell you that initially when we started out, there was sort of, let's see how it's progressed back. And now it is amazing because we have all the artists who understood what we've been able to do, which is very cutting edge. But remember that the museum is running art, the corporation, which is Chitsema, which is a very radical party, starting with political platform, and yet keep getting over the can. And the only museum in India as well that completely engaged with the contemporary and completely shows a lot of this kind of work. I'm also a member of the of the board and the National Health Office remains that make zero about art, just project contemporary. what is in the IBC and the statue, which was self-portrait, was very specific to engaging with the museum and looking at issues of time and cultural memory and loss. And so different artists have come in each touch on it. We had Jewish coming for that. We have coming now that is so proud of that in all their practice in tutorial strategy has to select the artists who are engaged in any way in interrogating history. Their practice is already situated in that context, but it's amplified that a certain understanding work of a history and that we now focus on that history. So I think that has been very interesting.
Tasneem, it's very difficult to, you're also, there's some breakup in your voice, but we're going to try to see if we can call you back so that there's a little bit better reception. I have to tell you that Chinese Skype was better than Indian. What can I say? No? And we'll come back to you very quickly.
Because I'm on the water. I'm very close to the sea, and so perhaps that has.
No, now it's a little better actually. There you go. Just because I compared you with Chinese. That's what it is. Let me come back to our colleagues here. And one of the things that I would love to know is that there are a number of artists who have often said to me that in fact they sometimes find that so many Western artists are so self-referential that in fact it feels almost like they're not of the world that they live in, whereas the rapid changes that are going on in Asia, they want to be part of that social context, that political context. They want to comment on that, and they feel that that self-referentiality that comes out of some of the Western global kind of context is not appropriate for them. Do you feel that this is something cultural, that in fact more artists are interested in commenting? I mean, I look at this particular installation here, and I'm very, very sensitive to the fact that on the one hand, it looks very much like other tabloid performative photographs set stage somewhere else within a gay community, and yet in the Indian context, it is so very powerful, because in fact even 10 years ago, 15 years ago, you would not have seen anybody do this kind of work. So that its sense of commenting on the world that is so rapidly changing is very different. And it's not just like commenting on the global context, it's also like something very, very local. Shanti, your thoughts on that?
That's a really good question, and I'm going to take a radical position on answering that. And I think it has a lot to do with the way institutions and the market positions, the way they both position the artist. And I'm taking these thoughts from Susan Buck-Morse, and the way she has really started thinking about revolution, modernism. Is there this artificial division now between the modernist moment and the postmodernist moment? And it appears that, and she's also following ideas that were put into play by Raymond Williams, and picked up actually very nicely by Rashid Areen, who wrote this wonderful essay you guys can read. It's 1989 third text, where he goes back and he actually thinks about where the field of contemporary Asian art is. And what they all pretty much discover is that in the West it's always been about representation, and but more than that, entering into the art market, they are turned, and all of their revolutionary thoughts are basically hidden, belighted by the market, who turns them into a hero, turns their art into commodities. And it seems then it's all about them. And any kind of social commentary they had is mystified, eclipsed. We don't see it. And perhaps that's the good thing about the fact that the market hasn't entered into Asia as much as it has here, obviously. Or the institutional structures haven't been created yet. And it's a time of experimentation. And as Karen was mentioning, they're trying to figure out new methodologies to somehow escape these kinds of traps so that their process, their thoughts, their dialectics, the way they want to go about thinking about society and themselves are not going to be elided by the market. And of course, the persona of the hero art. That's my opinion.
Mr. Shen, it seems to me that actually some people might say in China art is even more commodified because of the market, and somehow the Chineseness gets even more highlighted. Frida, both you and Mr. Shen, what's your thought on the marketplace and the notion of cultural, national identity?
In the first panel, people were talking about gatekeepers. I think the market is one kind of a gatekeeper. A certain kind of art will sell when it seems familiar and like a brand or something, then it sells even better and better. I think that what is acceptable in exhibitions, that's another kind of gatekeeping. I think that art that has to do with social issues has been exhibited a lot in the West, in part because it's a way of feeling like you're coming to grips with another culture. It's a little window into different parts of society in another part of the world. And while there certainly are other issues going on beyond the story that's on the surface, what people mostly see is the surface story going on. So I've been doing a lot of research on abstract art in China lately, which I think is a fascinating subject. And most people don't know that there is abstract art in China, but it's becoming quite a big force. But there, the issues are buried so deeply that it's not easy to get a grasp on it. You don't associate it with China. It's not so easy to market to anybody, whether it's collectors or museums or art magazines or anything, because it's not, you don't get an easy handle on it. So I think that the art world is very complicated. It's there's always a struggle between what's practical and what's ideal, and you want to approach things with passion, but it just doesn't always work out to be the practical way to do it. So you find it in between.
I think the reception part of it becomes very significant. That it's as much about how other people receive something. So Nasreen Mohammadi, for example, a wonderful Indian artist, until Deepak Tawar actually showed it. And then she was shown a documenta after her death. Up until that point, nobody wanted to look at her work because it's too abstract and it didn't have the cultural references into her work that people could then identify as something. But once she got into that cycle, then everybody wanted her work. So it's kind of an interesting question. Further thought?
I think you were referring to the, earlier on you were referring to the proliferation of easily recognizable icons, be it cultural or political icons, Chinese art. And that is quite simple, you know. The marketplace needs brands. It needs repetition. You need to keep hammering that stuff until everybody remembers it. And that's why you see all these Mao, you know, those big faces, Tiananmen, or terracotta, all these, you know, recurring symbols of Chinese. It's all, of course, very surface stuff.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the questions that came up in the first panel was that at what point do people feel that something is an anthropological reading, and at what point is it culturally nuanced reading, and how do you make that distinction? So that, for example, I look at that painting, that photograph right there, and I've been staring at it because of the first panel, and I kept thinking that as an art historian, and as somebody interested in contemporary art, I was simultaneously thinking about contemporary photography practice, that this is a very important part of. But it also, I could not think of the design pictures of the 17th century and the kind of Mughal architecture, the Rajput style, arches, and these men were almost like in the savannah, which was as secluded as they were secluded. And all of that layering is culturally specific. It doesn't take away from its other global dimension. But if it's only looked at in one place, then you're losing something else too. So how do we actually combine those readings that are not necessarily anthropological, but they are culturally nuanced? And how does that play out in scholarship today? And what do we need to do? How do we need to do that in terms of another collaboration? I'm looking at you, Santi, and I'm also going to ask you, Tasneem, yeah.
How to get that culturally nuanced reading? That's a really good question. And cultural language, visual cultures, of course, that Sunil Gupta is pulling from actually 3 sources. Day photography of the past, so looking at 20th century, early 20th century photography, he's pulling from his own identity as a South Asian male and how he's usually alienated from his own culture, and also a cinema legette, right, that is using for storyboarding here. So you just have to do the cultural homework. Come on, it's just the way it is. Do it. that's my answer. Learn the language, the visual language. Maybe even learn Hindi. Imagine being able to do that. The curators I'm talking to. So living there, perhaps. That's, you know, it's a blue sky, right? I hope. New turns. And that sort of thing. So, yeah, just being able to converse multilingually, visually as well. Is my
well, what you're saying is that parachuting in and out, getting what you want and then leaving is no longer an option. That you need to do digging down. You need to do just research like anything else.
Yeah.
And there's no substitute for that.
Right.
Melissa and I often talk about the fact that initially when we started doing this work, a lot of our colleagues would come and say, well, I'm going to X, Y, and Z country in Asia. Can you send me the slides and I want to look at the 2 artists and then I'll put them in the show. And finally we started saying, we're not doing this.
Yeah.
Go there. And they said, but I don't have the money. A little less money to go to Europe. Just find the time. Take the time to learn, because without that specificity, you in fact might not get all of the nuances. And so part of it is that how do we actually dig deeper? Because superficially things, too much like things you have seen. So in fact it's more dangerous in some ways. And I think that's an important point. Before I open it up to our audiences, any last thought on this idea of cultural specificity, global, local connections, and it being not so much about funny as it might seem.
I'd like to tell a little anecdote from, I think it was in 2000. I was at a conference in Chengdu. It wasn't a particularly international conference. It's not like Beijing or something like that. I think there were only 2 Caucasian people at the conference. And it was me and it was Robert Buena, the publisher. Robert got up he had to go take a break. One of the leading scholars at this conference stood up and said, foreigners can't understand Chinese art. Even Robert Buena, who understands the most, even he can't understand Chinese art. And you know, I thought, well, yeah, what's he saying about me? But basically, I think that the ideal that you will dig deep enough and you will understand enough to get at what the artist is trying to say. But if you're going to say that you have to be of the culture to understand the culture, if you push that to extremes, which I always find to be a really helpful exercise, then you decide that only somebody from Chengdu could understand art by someone who's from Chengdu. Only if you're a woman from Chengdu can you understand a woman from Chengdu's, art and so on. And we end up with only the artist can understand the art. And we all know artists often don't know what they're doing. And we're also left with the idea that we'll have no understanding whatsoever of art of the past. So maybe a crucial point is to understand that we need to make whatever effort we can, but we have to understand that we're never going to really get to the point of fully understanding art because it's not a precise science. So everybody brings something different to the experience of looking at a work of art, and we just have to hope that there's something valuable out of that experience.
But I think there's in fact something more than that, which is that there is also a value in multiple lenses. So outsiders looking at something that they're not part of is as important as people looking from inside out. That value, which in the early 90s in California was very high on this, the whole Asian American dialogue, that only Asian Americans, scholars could talk about Asia, everything else was colonial. And it's a very dangerous proposition, because you're saying nobody can learn something from some other parts of the culture. So that's, I think in itself, is very dangerous in some ways, if we don't pay attention to that.
Yeah, I just want to add that, this was supposed to be a philosophical discussion, and the whole idea of multiculturalism has come under criticism by contemporary artists of Asia. Agnes Areno, I think, is one of them. And when I was saying do the cultural homework, I really mean to say that only someone from that area could understand that area, but to find the connecting tissues, to see how we're all common in some regard, it's just as important to see what makes us different. And multiculturalism was all about difference and separating us and saying, oh, this is a black thing, this is a woman thing, you wouldn't understand, and stopping the discourse. And there's so much that these artists were having conversations about across borders. Like, just to end my statement here, I finally go to India, I go to Kalabhavan, Shantiniketan, and I'm talking to some of the artist students there, and they're reading Benjamin, they're reading Mechanical Reproduction. They're so sophisticated, but we don't know that. We don't know the conversations that they're having there across borders with French students who come to visit Kalabhavan, or German students who are coming to visit Kalabhavan. Those kinds of conversations aren't represented, I think, in the larger art historical curatorial discourses.
And all of that is their history too. Right. Because they're claiming it. It's like Chinese artists looking at boys is as important as them looking at something else. And how do we understand not just duality, but multiplicity of their context? That's important. Let's open it up, and I will also try, Tasneem, to bring you back to much better. Thank you. Right, no, that's perfect. So I'm going to open it up, the floor to the audience, and there's a hand back there. Please shout so we all hear you.
Yes. Can you hear me too, Skype? A little bit? I've Skyped in and it's really hard. This is bringing up a topic that I think is part of the conversation, and that's the intra-Asia contemporary. My work's all done pretty much in Japan, but this last year I was living in Berlin, and I found it absolutely fascinating because I'd only been in the Asian context of like what's contemporary between Asia, between Japan and China or Korea. And there'd be an incredible South Asian exhibit in Tokyo. What would happen there? So I'm curious what your spin on contemporary between Asias is, and how that's different from, you know, Benjamin in India doesn't make it okay. I mean, there's something else I'm really going with dissolving, fragmentation, dispersal you were talking about, and in a sense wanting the discomfort to go on. And so but I am curious if you have looked at what's happening between Asias on this platform of the contemporary.
I would say from our experience, actually, one of the things that's very interesting is that APT, the Asia Pacific, which is something Melissa talked about, and some of the first exhibitions we did, where we brought different artists together from different countries, it has spurred on the ways artists are talking to one another. I still would say that because of the Euro-American dominance in the modern and contemporary, for most of the artists, for the longest time, success was oriented towards the West. It is now that actually things are beginning to shift. But I do think that historically, for the last 300 years, because there's not been enough of intra-Asian dialogue, and ironically, not surprisingly, it is actually as the Western colonial powers come to Asia, trade routes begin to break, and as trade routes begin to break, intra-Asian connections begin to break. And those connections now are still very nascent. And then you have 20th century histories, where the distrust is huge among these nations. It's just beginning to happen now, and at the Asian Society, most of the work we're doing now is a lot about building communities that is not just intra-Asia, but with Americans being part of that conversation as a player, not the player. And how to create that community, which is quite different.
I'm going to respectfully add something more to that. And that is, there was a consciousness. I mean, think of Bharat Mata by Rabindranath.
Early 20th century is an entirely different phenomenon. Okay. So Tagore, we just have a show right now. I completely agree with you. There was a moment, 1907 to 1915, 1920, when people were beginning to and have this conversation across Asia.
Right.
It's an exception.
Okay.
And it dies. And you have to bring it back again.
Okay.
That's the truth.
And then there's also the indigenous art movement that was taking place in the Philippines, that tried to create a sensibility within Southeast Asia, especially regarding their material realities, that they didn't have the money to afford, the artists didn't have the money to afford canvas, oil, acrylics, and why not make art out of local materials that have to do with their environments. So there was an environmental movement that also spread out of the Philippines into Southeast Asia, outside of the Philippines into the rest of Southeast Asia. So there were small conversations taking place like that.
So hand back here.
I'd like to invert the conversation a little bit. One of the things that strikes me as I listen to all of you speak about the art on view here is that The questions are mostly about our representational structures. These exist in institutions, of course, the market is another, academia and the way in which we break down to regions and periods. And sort of how to get, whether art can come to exist in a way outside of our institutional structures and inform us in different ways. How do we use those institutional structures to get to this art? And I wonder if it's not that what the art is trying to do, what artists' job might be, is to expose the foundations of our structures of representation and perhaps demonstrate the ways in which they are insufficient. And so that the culture that we're looking at and examining might be not the culture that we see in a show of contemporary Indian art, but in fact our own culture being reflected back to us, a culture of institutional representation.
Comments from my fellow panelists?
I think the comment was absolutely correct in ways. I'm looking at a Filipino artist now. His name is Roberto Chavez. And here's an artist who's so fabulous, so great. He makes such an impact in modern history of the Philippines and even now in the contemporary moment. But he's never been shown outside of the Philippines in Singapore. And he did it purposefully. He remains invisible because he doesn't even pretend to imagine that the West can represent him in any way, and his kinds of questions. The latest piece is worth looking at, wonderful images on the internet. It's called 1001 Paintings That I Want to Do Before I Die. And what he's doing is commenting on a book that had just come out called 1001 Paintings You Must See Before You Die. And of course, I bet there's not one Filipino painting in there. So it's with those kinds of interventions, if you want, or playfulness even, that they are rendering those invisible dynamics within our institutions and structures visible.
I mean, I think one of the things that I find very interesting is that in many countries in Asia, there haven't been lots of institutions. So artists were constantly doing stuff with each other, around each other, which actually never saw the light of day. And in fact, they were not gallery structures, so especially the Philippines and Indonesia are really interesting that way. Performative things. If you think of China in the 80s, where, and it's sort of what Liu calls the apartment art, where you really were just looking at stuff in people's homes. I think one of the fun things that I find interesting and challenging about what's happening in Asia today, especially in rapidly developing countries, is that there's still, in fact, not a maturity of systems. So the market is kind of one big movement through which people are going through. But you don't really have enough in terms of academics, sort of scholarship on the one hand, or academic institutions, nor do you have enough museums and others. So in fact, you still have this issue of how artists navigate this whole ecology of art. And the truth is, in the West, things are very established. Whereas in Asia, it still has a kind of a going through a funnel syndrome that I don't think is completely resolved yet. So I think we have to remember that you're really looking at immaturity of the ecology, which both allows artists to do things in a different way, but the demand for the market success is much higher.
Observation of the Chinese system. In recent years, there has been a fairly large number of new museums and art centers open. But I think the system has not obtained the kind of credibility like the Western counterpart. For example, an artist can get a show in a major museum by renting space, can be like that. So there is not a credibility, a some of the shows in the major museums like the National Art Gallery in Beijing, these shows are so short. I was talking to a very prominent traditional Chinese ink painter, Mr. Xie. He is going to have a retrospective at age, I think age 70 next year. And he had a very high position in official art world. He's a member of the Chinese Artists Association and all the prestigious titles that you would like to have, you would want to have in China. But he has to pay still. He has to. The show is going to be, well, maybe 7 days, maybe 10 days, and at the National Gallery. And so we can't criticize the system as being, excluding the unofficial people who are, who don't have an official position. Just the system itself, because of lack of funding, because lack of I think more importantly, intellectual support. It's just not the same kind of animal that we expect in the West.
Thank you. There was a hand here, and Dustin, I'm going to see if you have to answer this next question. Yes.
The challenge that I find in the discussion between the local is that to an extent, these particular localized kind of paintings of art are showing up and being portrayed and exhibited in the centers and international spaces. And so when we look at these pieces of art, we are then often, these individuals are looking at them through international frameworks, and they are making references to Europe, Western, as we talked about earlier on. And so I'm thinking about American art and and one of the dialogues of that particular moment that we kind of couched at the beginning of this was that when we look at Latin American art, we're looking at Latin American art as derivative of traditions and then as being copying local at the West. And what ended up happening to a certain extent is the critics from Latin America engaged in the dialogue. So I guess my question is, to what extent are those internal dialogues actually coming out into the West and not just seeking out slowly, but are they active in the way that these pieces are being read? Or are Western frames and references still being dominant in terms of, and that's interesting.
Tasneem, I'm going to ask you to answer this question, which is how are the voices from the region, curatorial, critical, scholarly, actually contributing to the dialogue and redefinition of how things are seen?
This is apropos what you said earlier, Vishaka, that these sorts of institutions. Can you hear me now?
Yes. Yeah, that's fine.
Okay. You're still muted. So these institutions, exactly as you said, they are at a nascent stage. They are at a very early stage. For example, instituting first modern contemporary Indian art history course at the museum. It's a diploma, it's a postgraduate diploma. Now, if you consider that all of India, modern and contemporary is taught as part of the larger overview of art history from starting India dot. So there has not been a focus on modern and contemporary, and therefore even the critics, the curators have studied the practice as part of the way of thinking, and the philosophical references are all based on what they have learned in Western institutions. So again, this whole thing has to be contextualized in terms of meaning, and only when the discourse starts to happen, and it's at a very early stage in the country. Just like museums and in the establishment of museums in contemporary spaces, it's something that has only really taken off, as you know, in the last 5 years. Even 10 years ago, there were just a very, very few galleries. So this is all very, very new. And it's very important, of course, in India is now in focus as a huge engagement with contemporary, because it's forcing the government to take cognizance of this and to put some money into this, and so that we develop the dialogue. But apart from people like Kapoor, who is there and is really engaged on the international scale with other thinkers and intellectuals to articulate a position, that refers to Islam. And even because, which comes from a completely different way of thinking, that today, is very, of course, it seems to be significant and important, but there are all new ways of thinking. We are not even discussing that. So that's, it's a very nascent stage, and I hope that it develops.
Yeah, I would say that one of the things we have to remember, and at least at the HSI, when we first started doing this work, we were very careful to have people from within and without. So the reason, for example, we chose Gavin Liu to do the first show, so he was the one who did the first avant-garde show in China. He was completely from within, but he'd also been outside. Because I was very keen to have those voices heard, to develop the discourse so that it was not truly coming from the outside in. And when we did traditional tensions, Abhinand Poshananda from Bangkok. Now mind you, his PhD was from Cornell, but he also was completely seeped into the tradition out of Southeast Asia. Similarly, asking Gita Kapoor that Tasneem was talking about, a number of other scholars from different parts of Asia. I think we have to continue to do that. Even if their training may be partly Western, partly Asian, not whatever, is that they are steeped into those places. And what they have to say is something that's important. But also you can pair them with people who then can also interrogate that. So I think we have to go both ways. It's not really a one-way street, I think. Last question. We must, okay, sorry. Oh my gosh, there's two more, but very quick, okay? And then we'll get back to you.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really humiliating and pointless to have survey shows on entire continents. I mean, having been brought up in Britain and seen various ridiculous instances of India being represented, like the Festival of India, and, this ridiculous show, the Pompidou, and, Hans Ulrich's show, India Highway. I mean, frankly, it is ridiculous. And who would call it, British motorway? Imagine that. How reductive is it to kind of gather together a whole bunch of people and stick them into a show? I mean, from my experience, I think what is interesting is in moments like Geetha Kapoor has not really been raised much here, but I mean, there's two people I'd like to raise, and two like Geetha Kapoor and also Grant Watson's show, the Santhal family at Mukha, which took Ram Kinkar's sculpture, which is in Shantiniketan, as a point of departure to think about various notions and instances of modernism in India, which did not only mean, and postmodernism, which kind of was able, so the show was able to kind of be a keyhole into like a whole range of different practices. Because as you said, there were many people who were practicing those collectives. I mean, the relationship between decolonization in India and cultural practice is a huge topic, Delhi College of Modern Art, People's Theatre of India. So, yeah, that's no, it's a statement. I don't know if it's a question, maybe people want to respond.
Any comment from colleagues here? We'll leave it at that. Okay. Last question.
It's really lovely to get your perspective as an art historian on this photograph. I came in last week and saw the exhibition, and I think that it kind of was jarring, and not the homosexuality is my partner. But it did make me feel, okay, I'm from I recognize the space, I recognize the historical background, but it's offensive to me that pop culture can be depicted from that lens and that sensibility of this is
why should it define you? You have multiple identities, as does Sunil. And part of it is to recognize that neither you nor he need to be identified only one way. He happens to be an Indian, gay photographer who is interrogating, questioning, and reflecting who he is. I mean, I always say to people that no matter what I wear, half the time people say, gee, where are you from? And I say, I live in New York. And they immediately say, no, where are you really from, right? So we all have this issue. And yet the truth is we all inhabit multiple contexts, multiple identities. There is no reason why you should feel this reflects you. India is 1 billion plus people. And, you know, I must have ended this, that I first came to America as a 16-year-old. I was in Santa Barbara as an exchange student. Only one other Indian family. Somebody tried to fix me up with this guy who was a graduate student at UCSB. And I hated this guy. And I thought, oh my God, how could it be? This is the only Indian. How could I hate this person? And then I finally realized that not everybody in India is my friend. So why do I have to like this guy? It's okay. But the point is, when we are outside of our mainstream culture, sometimes we too feel like it must represent me.
It's not so much about personally speaking, but overall, if you see the entire exhibition, its totality, and talking about globalization, talking about in contemporary, that's where I find it. Is that the perspective of India that are represented? Not just by this artist, just in this context, but overall, and again, not to just reiterate, I'm sure I had a perspective on it, but I find the limitation of what is globalization, what is identity, to this one common thing that's instrumental.
And I think that's one of the reasons why I wanted to analyze that particular picture, because in fact there's so many other layers that you could look at. On that note, I think we have gone past our time. Thank you very much, and please join me in thanking our panel.